Thank you guys all for joining us. Super excited to introduce Kristin Barker and Erica Hansen, our two presenters today. Kristin is a PhD candidate at UC Berkeley. She did her master's on elk in Montana, and then her PhD work was focused in the Jackson Valley. Erica Hansen works for the Jackson Hole Land Trust. She is our landscape protection specialist and staff biologist. So with the introductions out of the way, I'll hand it over to Kristin to start. Oh, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end here. So you guys are welcome to put your questions in the chat or just save them for the end and we'll make sure they're answered.
All right. Thanks, Zach. Moment of truth. Can I share my screen correctly? All right. Do you see my title slide? Give me a cool. Okay. So, hi. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk to you guys. It's nice to interact with normal humans and not like a bunch of PhD students. So yeah, before I actually start my talk, I just want to make sure that I have a moment to tell all of you how many amazing people have been involved in, gathering a lot of the information that we're going to be talking about today. They'll all sort of come up, but yeah, this research doesn't happen, in a vacuum. And there have been so many people and agencies and funding that has contributed to all of this. So I just wanted to make sure to acknowledge that before we get started. Okay, so let's start by talking about the first two words in the title of the talk, big game. I don't love this phrase because big game are so much more than just a game. So these are really huge animals. They're in big groups. They're traveling over these really broad landscapes. And they have been shown to contribute to many really vital ecosystem functions. So as they're moving across different ecosystems, they are defecating, they're dying, they're pushing stuff around. And so they've been shown to contribute to nutrient cycling, especially nitrogen cycling, which is really important for plant growth. Similarly, they help with seed dispersal. Seeds can hitchhike on their fur or pass through their digestive systems. And actually a paper just came out, I think in Science last month, maybe, and they were looking at the ability of plants to kind of adapt to climate change and move into new areas. And they were sort of demonstrating that the ability of plants to cope with climate change is really limited when they lose their broad scale seed dispersers that allow them to move. So this particular function will probably be increasingly important as we move forward. And then because all these animals are herbivores and different species like to eat different kinds of plants, and they're usually moving around these big groups, they actually structure the plant communities that they move through. And then, of course, these animals are primary prey for a lot of big predators, and a lot of those carnivore populations are kind of recovering. And so these are really important animals for those species. And then also, as these big game are moving across the landscape, they can kind of take the pressure off of other animals. And so they have benefits for so many things. They're connecting all the levels of the ecosystems, and they're connecting separate ecosystems. But they're not just important for ecosystems, they're also important to us. This is like the last group that I need to tell that wildlife viewing is important to people, because you won't be able to make a left onto the highway here in a few months. Obviously, people like to look at these animals. They're also really important for hunting and outfitting. And hunting isn't just important from a sporting perspective. It also, it connects people to the land and to their culture and to their community. Outfitting, can help support families. And so through these kind of wildlife viewing and hunting and outfitting benefits, it's been shown that these types of animals are huge benefits for economies from the local to the national level. And also, although it's difficult to quantify, there have been some social studies that indicate many cognitive and spiritual benefits that we can get from these animals too. So because big game are more than just game, we are now no longer going to refer to them as that for the rest of the talk. We are now going to call them ungulates or hoofed mammals, basically things in the deer family. And a lot of those benefits that we just talked about have to do with the fact that ungulates migrate. And just to make sure we're all kind of on the same page about how migration works, in our neck of the woods, sort of in the winter, ungulates are kind of bunched up in lower elevation areas. Basically, there's less snow there. It's easier for them to move around and find food. And then in the spring, as that sort of flush of green vegetation moves uphill, they move up into the high country and kind of spread out, tracking something about that vegetation. And the key here is that the younger and fresher the plants are, the more nutritious they are to these animals. So they're trying to get as much food as they can through their migrations. So this is a nice, tidy story, right? But it doesn't always happen. And, in recent years, we've been seeing more and more instances of animals not migrating. And for ungulates in our region, when they don't migrate, they're typically hanging out on that low elevation winter range. And of course, this can cause a lot of issues. That's where roads are. So there's always a danger of, motor vehicle safety problems. They can get into hay. They do get into hay that's grown for other species. There are risks of disease transmission, not only among these wild animals, but between them and livestock. And then also because winter range is down in these low elevation areas, tend to be privately owned, these animals can be less accessible for hunting. And that's not just important for hunters and outfitters, it's also important to managers because hunting is kind of the main tool that we have to help maintain populations within objective levels. So to kind of start understanding why ungulates do and don't migrate, a lot of people for a long time have been wondering where migrants move and why they move there. And, we used to have to just go out and hope that we could see them. And there, some folks would like put these big colorful collars on animals. And then in the summer, they just go hike around and try to like look for the collars. And so that was sort of some early efforts. I don't know if you know this, but the first ever radio collared elk was collared on the refuge in 1970, and the newspapers called her Monique the Space Elk because her radio collar talked to satellites. But this collar was kind of huge and heavy and extraordinarily expensive. So it took a while actually for these satellite collars to really come to the forefront in wildlife research. But now we have GPS collars on animals that basically allow us to look at where they're moving in near real time. So here are some locations recorded every 2 hours from an animal, and we can just pull them up on our computer and see fine scale how these animals are using the landscape. So instead of having to go and look for them, we actually know where they're going. And this has really, really been huge in studies of migration ecology. And one of the really cool things that we've learned is that Wyoming is a top migration superstar. I don't know if you guys know this, but you have some award-winning migrations in your state. For one thing, the first federally protected migration corridor is in Wyoming. It's called the Path of the Pronghorn, and it was just designated in 2008. And these pronghorn go from the Red Desert in the winter up to the Hoback in the summer. And they go right through our very own Gros Ventre. So if you're going up the Gros Ventre Road from town and the Red Hills are on your left, if you look down at the edge of them, kind of where they go down and meet the river bend right here, that's the Path of the Pronghorn, and it's very visible. So if you ever want to go see it, you can see it from the road. And so this corridor is protected, but it's also important to note that, it's not just a thin corridor that's important to people. And you'll probably hear more about, specifics of the types of easements that Jackson Hole Land Trust has, but I know they have some easements out around this same area. So that's very cool. Another award-winning migration is that Wyoming is home to the longest known migration in the contiguous US. So there is a little lady named Deer 255, and she moves over 240 miles twice a year from the Red Desert in the winter up into Island Park, Idaho in the summer. So what we've been learning, I should note, this was not even known until like less than 10 years ago. So all of this information is newly filtering in, and we're learning more things every day. But one of the main things that we keep learning is that ungulates, and especially Wyoming ungulates, cover lots of land. And we'll kind of go through this map in more detail here in the upcoming slides, but These colored lines are different migrations. Then we've got Yellowstone and Grand Teton there kind of in the middle. And the colors in the background of the map represent different land ownerships. So animals that cover lots of land go through land that's owned by lots of landowners. So if we zoom in kind of on this southern part of the map here, the purple colored lines are example migrations of mule deer. And 255 is kind of part of this group, but she just like keeps on trucking for whatever reason. And then the orange line is the path of the pronghorn. And this graph here now on the right shows the sort of variety of land ownerships that these animals are moving through from the time that they're on their winter range, they're on the left of the bar, over to when they're on their summer range on the right end of the bar. And the key point, the takeaway here is that there are a lot of colors on these bars, and the colors correspond to different landowners. So these animals are moving through this huge matrix of different types of land, and there's kind of a trend of sort of more technically protected, like federally protected land on the summer ranges than on the winter ranges. Then if we zoom in on the northern portion of this map, these green colors represent different elk herd migrations. And so on the right there, you'll see the Jackson herd down in purple. So these are the elk herds that come in and out of Yellowstone and Teton. And this was sort of the most comprehensive map that we'd had so far, but now special new information that you're some of the first people to see. Our research group has gathered an even larger data set, trying to really spread out our understanding of what elk are doing across a really broad region. So this is a postdoc in our lab. Laura Gigliotti is kind of leading this effort to look at how migratory elk are using this landscape. And one of the things she wanted to look at was how they're using different types of land. And so these graphs, again, you're like the first people to see them, are showing different kinds of land protections on different ranges for elk. So on the left is what elk are experiencing on their winter range, and on the right is what they're experiencing on their summer range. And each bar represents a different elk herd from what they're looking at. And so the bars are showing you what types of protections are on the land that each one of these herds are using. So the dark green is like a technically protected land, like a national park or a forest land. The yellow are conservation easements, and you can see that a lot of herds are using easement land. And then the light green are areas that aren't technically regulated or protected. And again, we see this similar trend of, using more technically protected areas in the summer and fewer in the winter. And the point of this is not to say, oh no, there's like some non-protected land. Obviously, this land that's not technically protected is still really valuable and important to these animals. So the point isn't to say, oh no, look at the gray. The point is to say these animals are moving through a really diverse landscape, and all of these different kinds of lands are providing them benefits. So the main takeaway here is that connectivity between all these different kinds of lands is really the key for helping to maintain these natural behaviors. So what do we know about what happens if we lose connectivity? Well, we know migrations can change to accommodate that. So there's some research showing that mule deer move faster when they're going through oil fields while migrating. And this can have some implications for how well they're actually tracking that fresh food that they're looking for during their migrations. Also, we've seen that pronghorn will reroute their migrations around fences, which can cause them to have to travel a lot farther. So sometimes animals are able to kind of change their migrations to account for lost connectivity, although there are often costs associated with that change. Also, migrations can just be completely lost. And a really classic example of this was in Botswana. They had to build a big veterinary fence to benefit like wildlife and livestock due to some conflict issues. And that fence, unfortunately, had to cut off wildebeest and zebra from a summer range that they used to migrate to. And so those migrations completely stopped. But this isn't just a one-off case. So as of 2009, a quarter of the mass ungulate migrations across the globe are known to have been lost, or we're not really sure what's going on with them. So losing connectivity is a little frightening. So what happens if we regain connectivity? It turns out sometimes, and this isn't the norm, but some migrations can be restored naturally. So when the fence came down, they took the fence down in Botswana, and within 4 years, the zebras had recovered their old migration route and were using that same old summer range. And this is really remarkable because that migration hadn't occurred for generations within these zebra. So sometimes migrations can be naturally restored. More often, they can't. There are some ways to try to restore migrations by, human intervention. And one of my favorite examples of this is the Jackson elk herd. So in the 1940s, a local biologist wanted to restore the historic migration because the Jackson elk used to winter in the Red Desert, and he wanted them to do that again. So they trapped a bunch of elk, they trucked them out around the Red Desert into all these places, and they baited them around with hay to try to get them to move where they wanted. And they're like hazing them with men on horseback. There were some people flying around like in airplanes in the mix, just trying to move them around. And it was like somewhat sort of successful. It was before they had the helpful collars, so it was a little challenging. They just had to like hope they would see the elk again later. But the sort of takeaway from this was they were able to, get animals to move where they wanted, but like at what cost, right? So they had to constantly be baiting them and physically moving them around. And, obviously that migration is not currently restored. So if you're not able to just continually do this, it's not very likely to work. Also, there are some migrations that we don't know how to restore. So there's some really cool work by Blake Lowry and his research group looking at bighorn populations. And there have been a lot of bighorn herds that died off due to pneumonia and other disease outbreaks. And so in some cases, biologists would take bighorns from other areas and put them back into places where populations had been lost. So those are called restored populations. And then in other cases, the population had been pretty well decimated, but there were still some animals left. And so those were just supplemented with a few more animals. So we consider those augmented populations. And then there are several populations that are native, that they've just been living in that spot for a really long time. And this graph on the axis on the left is the distance that they move from summer to winter. And the main take home here, there are a lot of other take homes from this work, but the main take home for our purposes is that the restored populations are much less likely to migrate. They're much less likely to move long distances, and they had a really less diverse kind of amount of behaviors. And so the point is that these animals were put back into a place that had connectivity, and they were not able to restore those migrations. So in order to understand how we can keep facilitating and allowing these natural behaviors to occur, it would help to know why animals migrate or why they don't. So that would help us answer questions like, why does an individual decide to move? How consistent are those reasons for different individuals? And answering those questions can help us understand how we might be able to encourage those behaviors. And getting at these questions requires moving from looking at these broad scale patterns to drilling in and understanding fine scale behavioral mechanisms. So that's one of the things I was working on for my master's. And I worked with some really helpful folks at Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks. And we pulled together all of the elk collar location data that they had collected with good GPS collars. So we had a decade of data from 16 herds, over 300 females. And what we did was we took their collar locations and we looked at whether they migrated or not. And for the record, animals do a bunch of weird intermediate things too, but just for the purposes of this talk, they migrated or they didn't. And so these like blue colors would be locations during a winter, and the green colors would be locations during a summer. And, we could see some animals move to different areas, like the migrant on the left, and some animals didn't go anywhere at all, like the resident on the right. So based on that and their locations, we then looked at on their winter range, what experiences those animals had prior to when they migrated. So to sort of understand whether migrants and residents were responding to the same cues or not, and whether their responses were similar across this whole landscape. So we were looking at things like food that was available and how old the animal was, and all kinds of things, but we're going to yada, yada, yada that. So after we compared those experiences, what we found was that migration was most likely for elk that lived in areas where forage varied predictably from year to year. So if an animal moved somewhere in the summer that had really good food, she could kind of count on that food being available again in the subsequent summers. It was also most likely for areas where elk winter ranges didn't include irrigated agriculture, but if there was better food available somewhere else, those animals would readily migrate out of irrigated agricultural land to get to that food. We also found, and I'm not going to go through this whole graph, but in general, the idea here is that there was little to no difference among why migrants moved among all of these herds. So that kind of suggests that there's not a whole lot of difference in the drivers of migration. So the types of like management or conservation techniques that we might use would be expected to have pretty similar effects over a wide area, which is hopefully helpful. So that kind of begs the question, why then are there so many animals that aren't migrating? And one of the things that we thought about was that migrants are eating in different areas from non-migrants during the summer and fall. And there are some oddly specific studies that show direct links between nutrition during summer and fall and the ability of elk to survive and reproduce the following year. So another question that we asked during my master's was, maybe there are increasing numbers of ungulates that don't migrate because they have access to better nutrition. And so to answer that question, this is going to be another yada, 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 but we figured out what elk were eating based on what was in their poop. We sampled all those plants in like hundreds and hundreds of plots across the landscape, just focusing on one herd because this is a pretty fine scale. We sent samples to the lab to measure the nutrition of all of those forage plants at each of their life stages. And then we could use that information and information about the environment to map out the nutrition available to elk across the landscape. And then from there, we could put elk collar locations on top of that and actually see, how much nutrition that elk had access to throughout the summer and fall. And we compared residents and migrants and others to see about their nutritional access. And we found, yes, non-migrants do have access to better nutrition, no matter how we sliced it. Like all summer, on any given day during the summer, increasingly throughout the summer. So based on this information, I titled my master's thesis, "Home is Where the Food Is." And I want you to note, I defended and published this in 2018. Okay, this was the year in which this was published in the buck rail. The Jackson elk herd just confused everything that I thought I knew about elk. So in 2018, these elk walked past perfectly good open feeding areas and just went down to congregate on the refuge where they weren't even being fed. And this was like keeping me up at night. And luckily, the PhD advisor I was just about to be working with, Arthur Middleton, is also very interested in elk. He's the one who's pulling together all these elk maps. And so he was interested in trying to look at and understand why elk distributions are changing in relation to things more than just food. And luckily, all of the agencies in Jackson also happen to be rather interested in this question. So we were able to work with a bunch of really amazing people from all of these management agencies to try and get at why elk distributions are changing. And that's what I'm working on right now in the PhD. So what we've kind of, how we're framing this is there sort of three things that elk are experiencing simultaneously during the winter. For one thing, there's snow. And during the winter when they left the Gros Ventre, it was a really low snow year. For another thing, there's wolves. And during the year when they left the Gros Ventre, it was a really high wolf year. For another thing, there's people. During the year they left the Gros Ventre, there were some feed grounds and some non-feed grounds, and recreational activity was different. And then there's always this road mortality thing that elk have to deal with. And so because all of these factors are happening all at the same time, it's really hard for us to disentangle and understand which factors are contributing to these changes that we're seeing in elk distributions. So if we can get information about each one independently, we can kind of see how they're working together. So we have some information about snow. We have data from weather stations and places where people are measuring snow. And we have information about humans. We know where feed grounds are and where we're recreating. But something that we have relatively less information about is how wolves are affecting elk. So we have ideas about, the numbers and density of wolves, but we don't know kind of where they're killing things, what risky areas are, and how elk are actually responding to that risk. So to get at this third piece of the puzzle, we initiated a wolf predation study in January 2019. And we again got to work with a bunch of amazing people. So Game and Fish and the Park Service graciously shared real-time access to all the wolf collar data. So based on that, we were able to use their GPS locations and find clusters of locations. So basically, we were just looking at where wolves were hanging out. And then we would go in and investigate those areas to see if there was something dead there. And in each place we went, we would gather information about the environment and geography. And if we found something dead, we would take a bunch of samples and gather information about that as well. And this portion wouldn't have been possible without being able to access the elk refuge and Forest Service lands where the ungulates were wintering, so that we could really get a full picture of how wolves were influencing elk across their whole winter range. So this was a really big kind of collaborative effort. And over 3 winters, we investigated more than 1,000 cluster sites. And of those, we found 170 that were potential or likely wolf kills. So once we knew where wolves were killing elk on the landscape, they were primarily killing elk, spoiler alert, although there were some other species. So once we knew where wolves were killing things on the landscape, we could then compare characteristics of those kill sites to areas where wolves weren't killing things to see what makes an area more or less risky for ungulates. And so you get some more new information. We have some very preliminary results, but some key messages that are coming through are wolves kill ungulates where animals are most available and most vulnerable. But vulnerability doesn't necessarily mean the animal is old and weak. An animal can be vulnerable because it's in deep snow, in a ditch with a bunch of vegetation around. And so environmental factors and prey availability were really important in helping us understand where these risky places are located. Another thing we found is what we're doing is we're making these we're making models and using different ways of explaining characteristics of kill sites versus non-kill sites. And we're kind of competing those models against each other to see which ones best explain the patterns of predation risk that we're actually seeing in the real world. And based on these comparisons, we're finding that models that include human influences in them significantly improve our ability to explain these patterns of predation risk that we're seeing. So that tells us that humans are having an effect on where risky places are for ungulates. We also see that wolves can respond differently to different human influences. So, they find some benefits from things that we're doing, and they find some costs from other things that we're doing. And they also respond less strongly to humans when prey are less available. So if a wolf is somewhere where it's hard to find food, and then it finds some food by some people, it's not as likely to, be avoiding people. So based on this information, what we're doing now is we're kind of finalizing and tweaking models to determine the best way that we can sort of understand and explain these patterns of predation that we saw across the landscape. After we've done that, then we can use that model to develop a spatial map of predation risk across Jackson Hole. So we can look at areas that are more or less risky. And then, and this is really cool, now we have elk and wolves collared in the same place and time. So we can put that information on top of the map, and we can see how elk are actually responding to all of these different things. So we can see how they're moving across the landscape based on how risky the areas are, and also based on how close wolves are to them, and based on other aspects of the environment and human influences that are also important. And a really cool thing about Jackson, from a research perspective, is one of these human influences is feed grounds. That means that we know where food is located, so we can actually evaluate how elk feeding behavior changes in response to all of these things. And this is a really cool key point because there is a video that I have a personal vendetta against. So I don't know if you've seen this video. If you haven't, I don't recommend it, but it's widely available and very much shared, and it's called How Wolves Change Rivers. And this video tells a story, and what's really cool about this story is that it does a good job of communicating that everything in the ecosystem is interconnected. What's less cool about the story is that we don't have support for it. So the story goes, wolves were gone, and then wolves came back. We reintroduced them into Yellowstone, and then wolves moved elk around. So then willows grew back that the elk used to be eating, and then the beavers came back, and then songbirds flourished, and then stream beds were stabilized, and the water table rose, and the rivers changed. And so this is a lovely story, but what the data goes is wolves were gone and wolves came back. That's what we know. Sometimes wolves move elk around, but sometimes they don't, right? So sometimes wolves show up and elk like book it, a couple drainages away. Other times wolves show up and elk kind of like just give them the side eye and go back to eating. So even this first premise of like wolves move elk around is not consistently supported by the data. And then another thing, the next stage is that, the story says willows grew back. So the premise here is that the effect of wolves on elk changes the feeding behavior of elk and the food that they're eating. So if we can actually look at feeding behavior of elk and how it changes in response to wolves, we can get a little more understanding about, how these ecosystem processes and trophic cascades might really be playing out. And this is particularly important because, as this other really cute video notes, all of this information that they're putting in the video is coming out of Yellowstone National Park. And in Yellowstone, human influence is really highly regulated. But what we really want to know about is how wolves and elk interact with each other and affect the ecosystem in the real world where people live and work and play. And we know that humans affect wildlife behavior, right? You and I have been talking about this. We know that humans affect the timing and locations of ungulate migrations. We've seen that humans change natural patterns of wolf predation across the landscape. So it stands to reason that humans might also change interactions between predators and their prey. So it's really important as we're doing these studies to explicitly include human influences into our analyses to really get a better understanding of how these things are playing out in the real world. It's also important to note that we've seen that animals respond differently to different types of human influences, right? And this is going to be increasingly important because the influences that these animals are responding to are constantly changing. And so we talk about animals as having behavioral plasticity or flexibility. The idea is that many animals are able to adaptively respond to changing external conditions, like by changing the timing of their migration or something. But external conditions are going to be changing increasingly and perhaps more swiftly in the future as the human population is growing exponentially. People are moving into new areas. We have high demand for more development, more housing. We've got these climate changes, like everything is just a little up in the air. And so the fact that some animals can adaptively respond to changing conditions has really cool and important implications for the valuable ungulate migrations that we were talking about earlier, because we know that ungulates are actually really flexible in their behavior. So a study we did recently, led by my friend Wenjing, we searched all of the literature and reports that we could find across the globe to look at reports of changes in ungulate migration, so things that we know have changed. And we found that ungulates can change all dimensions of their migrations. They can change in the spatial dimension. They can change where they're going to, where they're going from, where they're moving through. They can change things about the temporal dimension, so how long they're moving or when they leave and come back. We've also found a lot of evidence for animals just changing between whether they even migrate or not between years. So, and each bar, so what I'm showing you here is a map the map shows the areas where we found studies. So obviously some places are better represented than others, but the point is that this flexibility is occurring all across the world in lots of ungulates. And the graph here shows there's a bar for each species, and the different colors correspond to different types of migration change, basically. So the point here is that we found evidence of migration change in tons of species all across the globe. So this suggests that this flexible behavior could be really valuable if we want to be ensuring continued natural behaviors in the future. So one way that we can do that is just by facilitating this flexibility specifically. So to do that, one thing we can do is keep working to understand the drivers of these changing behaviors and the consequences of their changes. So why is behavior changing and what can we do about it and how does it affect the animals? Another thing that we can do to facilitate flexibility is to provide an array of connected open spaces, because this gives animals options to be more flexible and change their behaviors as things change. And another thing that we found when we were looking at all of these worldwide studies is we looked at different external changes and we linked them to different types of migration changes. And as you can see, it was a bit of a spider web. So up at the top, we don't have to dig too far into it, but the idea here is up at the top, we found changes in migration responding to biotic interactions, to different human influences, to climate, to weather. So these animals can be really flexible in response to a lot of different things. And then down on the bottom shows the different kinds of migration changes that we see. So the idea here is, if we want to keep facilitating these behaviors, facilitating flexibility is really going to be a key goal. And the work of Jackson Hole Land Trust and places like it that can help with providing this connectivity that is really helpful is going to be super key, in addition to some continued research. So that's all I've got. I think we should just turn it over to Erica now. So let's see, I have to stop sharing, right? Yeah, okay. I think that worked.
Thank you so much. Now I'll attempt to get mine up. Bear with me for just a second. Let's see here. Can you guys see that okay? Excellent. Kristin, thank you so much for that. There's just so much amazing research going on in Wyoming relating to ungulates right now. And so for us as an organization working in conservation, it's just really, it's kind of the dream to be working in a landscape that has so many amazing human communities and amazing species of wildlife, and then has really good science to back up the conservation actions that are happening. So it's a really exciting time for us as a land trust. And as Kristin mentioned, that science is constantly evolving and we're learning more about animals and how they move across the landscape and what they need. And so for us, we are trying to stay as up to date as we can with the best available science so that we can make sure that we are being really strategic and nimble with our conservation actions on the ground. So I'm just going to take a few quick minutes and talk about the Land Trust work and how it relates to Wyoming's ungulates, and then I will pass it off for questions. So the Jackson Hole Land Trust works in partnership with private landowners to preserve open spaces, wildlife habitat, working lands, and community spaces across Northwest Wyoming. And our particular area of focus is really the portions of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem that fall within Wyoming. So if you guys can see my cursor, it's sort of this corner of Wyoming that goes from Star Valley through Sublette County and then up into the Cody area, and encompasses the whole corner of the state. So that is really where we focus our work. Now, in the West, private lands often have some really particular characteristics. The way the West was divided up during European settlement means that a lot of private lands are along really lush riparian corridors, they're in valley bottoms, they're in places that are really resource rich, because those are places that European settlers were seeking when they moved west. This picture is of the South Fork of the Snake, and you can see this kind of mosaic of cottonwood galleries, and then we have hay meadows in the background and some development and people's houses. And that's pretty typical of across the West. And that is really unique in that, you know, you wouldn't expect to see as many huge developments high up in the mountains where water is hard to get. You know, it doesn't mean that there aren't some there, but it means that a lot of that human activity is concentrated in some of these lower lying areas. And we can really see that when we look at how lands are divided up across the landscape, when we kind of take a step back and look at that patchwork. So this is an aerial image of Sublette County on the left, and you can see all these amazing river corridors that are really lush, really green, a lot of riparian habitat. And then if we put a mask over that landscape that shows, that blocks out all of the federal, tribal, and state lands in the upper Green River region in Sublette County, we can see what's left. And these are all the private lands. We can really see how they're concentrated in the foothills, in floodplains, in riparian corridors, in areas where there are a lot of resources for people. And so because that distribution is of private lands is unequal across the landscape, it really means that private lands have an outsized contribution in how wildlife use the land in Wyoming. We can see that when we look at big game crucial range in the state. Again, this sort of grayed out area is federal, tribal, and state lands. Anywhere that's bright blue is where private lands overlap with designated big game crucial range. We can see that there's those concentrations of crucial range in foothills areas, in lower lying areas, and in places where private lands are really concentrated. So private lands serve two really important roles. They preserve migratory linkages between large swaths of federal, state, and tribal lands, and they provide crucial seasonal habitat in and of themselves. So habitat quality on these lands is really important, as well as how they contribute to a functional landscape on the larger scale. And we know, as Kristin mentioned, varied ownership can really create compounding challenges. So there's all these things going on like fences and roads and disturbance. We have disturbance from lights and pets and noise and cars and activity and, you know, recreationalists and any number of things that involve humans moving across the landscape. And we know that habitat loss and degradation can have a huge impact on wildlife. And those two, habitat loss and degradation, can really have lasting long-term impacts, as we learned from Kristin. One of the ways the Jackson Hole Land Trust works to help be strategic about how we address habitat fragmentation and degradation is through the use of conservation easements. So conservation easements are a voluntary partnership between a landowner and the land trust, where both parties agree to preserve certain values present on the property. So those values might be working lands, they might be wildlife habitat, or open spaces, scenic vistas, or community places. The conservation values on every property are different and really unique to the property. And the conservation easement is tailored to protect those specific values present on the property. We know, looking at conservation easement placement on the landscape, that animals do move through and use conservation easements. So this is a map from the Wild Migrations book, which I highly recommend if anyone is interested in learning more about this. And you can see these green lines are elk moving through the Jackson area, and the sort of orangey shapes are conservation easements. So we know that animals need to find pathways to move across the landscape to move between their winter and summer habitats. In the Jackson area, it's important to remember, and really anywhere, but in the Jackson area, because things are especially concentrated, that there are a lot of dynamics going on this landscape, you know, that are not visible on a map. So there's human activity, there's development that's happening in areas, you know, that are not shown on this map. There's many different land ownerships that aren't shown. And so these animals are trying to navigate a landscape where there's so many overlapping things influencing their behavior. And conserved lands give them options for how they move across the landscape. Likewise, this is the Sublette County. So we're looking at the upper green again. You can see Bondurant up here, and I want to highlight that area because we're going to talk about it a little more in just a moment. But these are movements from several different ungulate species moving across Sublette County. Sublette County is a little different than Teton County. There's large working ranches that really protect crucial linkages between federal lands. And likewise, these large ranches provide really key water resources and lush forage for migrating animals. The areas in between, remember those grayed out areas I showed on my map of the upper green earlier, are a lot of times drier sagebrush steppe that animals need to navigate where there might not be as many resources. And so they move through these areas and really rely on those lush riparian habitats where there's a lot of water resources as they move to and fro across the landscape. And as we know, large-scale collaboration is absolutely essential for protecting these habitats. So we have lots of landowners that these animals are moving across. You guys saw this map earlier. These are elk migrations. But it also takes a lot of partners to pull projects together that result in, long-term effective strategic conservation. So we might have public-private partnerships. We might have coordination between different agencies. We might have really strategic conservation actions that are driven by science. And for all of that, we need detailed knowledge of wildlife behavior and how they're making decisions about how they move across the land. So I do want to talk about one example of this collaboration, a conservation easement that we closed on in December of 2021. This is our Jack Creek conservation easement, and it is right outside of Bondurant. So you can see it in red right there. It is 280 acres, and it is sandwiched between Forest Service land. So all this mint green kind of land is Forest Service. So we know that it, from just looking at it, anyone could tell you that this, enhances connectivity across these swaths of federal land here. But what we really didn't know until recently was exactly how animals were moving through that area and how important it was. And that is why this new research is so important, because we're able to actually take that research and implement it to show how and why animals are using specific properties. We know Jack Creek, so these are all photos of the Jack Creek Ranch. We know that it is really lush, well-stewarded working ranch land. There's a lot of water resources on it, an amazing landowner family that are excellent stewards of the land for their multi-generational cattle operation. And they were really conservation minded. So they reached out to the land trust about preserving habitat on their ranch in perpetuity. So from looking at the landscape, you can tell that the habitat on there is really well taken care of. And so the habitat value within the property itself is incredibly important. But when we look at how that ties into animal movements across the greater landscape, we know that animals also rely on that property to move through it. So I've got two maps here. One that shows a draft pronghorn migration corridor, and one that shows mule deer migrations, which are the two tones of blue, and then elk corridors, which are the sort of dashed orange lines. Now, these data sets all come from different studies on different species, but we can see that because of the topography of where Jack Creek is located, animals are really driven to move through that area. There's some low saddles on the south side and the north side of the property, and animals move directly across the property as they migrate every year. Now, I do want to remind everyone that, we have Forest Service land to the north and to the south, and so preserving this linkage across this private land is incredibly important. So not only are animals using the habitat on the property because of the inherent habitat value on the property itself, but it's really important to tie that landscape together. And without the recent science that we have, we would have known the animals move through, but we wouldn't have known where they came from or where they were going to. And so stitching together these pieces of the landscape puzzle is really helping us be strategic about the type of conservation that we're doing. Because we had such good science supporting that project, we were able to complete it with the help of a number of different partners. So I do want to note that it would not have been possible without all these folks who made significant contributions to the success of the project, for which we're really grateful. And because of the amazing science that we were able to use, we were able to really help tell the story of the property and its importance when we were working with all of our partners. So really incredibly grateful for that. And with that, I think I'm out of time, so I will be quiet and we can get into some questions.
Yeah, anyone with a question, feel free to write it in the chat or just unmute and speak up and we'll get it answered.
What about the bison?
What about them?
Well, they don't move like very long distances, right? They may come down from Triangle X to their refuge for the winter and then back up there in the summer. They're shorter migrations. I don't even know if you call them migrations.
Yeah, those are the great bison migrations are one of the ones that are considered lost now. Those animals are so big and they need so much land that it's really hard for them to, be able to move across the landscape like they used to. So yeah, they are certainly moving, but and there are some migrations kind of in and out of Yellowstone. I'm thinking kind of in the northern part, but so they are moving, but certainly their migrations are very truncated if they're occurring at all.
Kristin, it looks like we got a question in the chat that's directed at you.
Yes. I'm not sure what the easiest way is to do that, but I can and I will.
Kristin, if you send them over to us, we can include them in our wrap-up email to everyone.
Okay, perfect.
Awesome.
I'll do that.
Kristin, I have a question for you about your work looking at migration plasticity. And I'm just would love to know more about your perspective about how, I don't know if reconcile is the right word, but how you sort of factor in that knowledge of how ungulates are plastic and how they choose to migrate with, some, other studies that have been done that show that, some migrations that have been altered aren't as successful.
Yeah. Yeah, that is a very good question and a complicated one. So there's sort of, just because an animal can change its behavior doesn't mean that that changed behavior is really beneficial. They might just be trying to make the best of a bad situation. Like, yeah, you're at the grocery store and the lines are really, really long and you're like, I'm going to move to this other line. It seems better. And like, it really wasn't better. Sometimes that can be happening. And that's sort of a next stage in research is understanding what we call the fitness consequences of changing behaviors. And it's really hard to get at that because you have to track the same animals for multiple years in a row to understand, like, are they having babies? Are their babies surviving? How long are these animals living? And, the GPS collars last maybe 2 years usually. So to keep recollaring the same animals and tracking their babies is really challenging. The Wyoming Migration Initiative is doing some really cool work with that. But it's sort of, I feel like it's the next stage of migration research is kind of understanding like whether changing behaviors are beneficial or not. And that'll kind of help us understand more about, whether and to what degree we expect to see increasing residency as opposed to migration.
Well, availability of food year round, if it's there, they're not going to move, I wouldn't think. If I'm happy at Creekside with their sandwiches, I'm not going to go down to Smith's to get a sandwich.
Why would you go to Smith's when you have Creekside? I miss Creekside. Well, but we did find in that one study that, if there's Creekside, but maybe you also like chicken and you have like the bird available also, like that could draw you away from Creekside sometimes. And so we did find, even if animals have that irrigated ag available to them, they will still leave if there's something good somewhere else. So It's not like a lost cause just because there's good ag land that they're not going to move, although that certainly does help encourage them to hang out.
Do they change diet very often?
Yeah, the different species like different kinds of plants, but so they like to focus on the same things, but they will move to different areas and kind of eat different plants that are available there. Some species are more flexible than others in what they eat.
What do you really want to see to call something migration? Our moose here on the upper green don't necessarily move in a linear fashion, long distances, but they sure do shift altitude. We've got an old moose with a lop deer that I've seen, 2,000-3,000 feet above the house here, and yet in the winter she's down in the willows, and beds here, around the property. Is that a migration when I don't see that particular animal for 7 or 8 months at a time, and do see her up at a higher elevation?
That is sort of, you can answer that question however you like, and you can find some data to support it. That's a huge challenge actually with all of this science. And I sort of mentioned and then glossed over all of these like behaviors that aren't clearly migration or non-migration. And there are all these different ways that people are trying to classify behaviors and describe behaviors. And there are all these different like fancy methods people are coming up with. And the kind of take home is that these animals are doing a lot of really different, weird, nuanced stuff. And it's sort of up to, that migration is in the eye of the beholder, I guess. And you can consider something a migration, or a range shift is another thing that people will say if it's not a full migration. People also consider just elevational migration as a type of migration. So, moving uphill and downhill, still counts. But yeah, there's a lot of nuance, and it's really not fair to say an animal does or doesn't migrate.
Well, like the bighorn sheep that are in the refuge in the winter go up in the grove on to have their babies.
Yep.
Is that considered a migration?
Yes, that's generally considered a migration. But you also have that really cool bighorn sheep population that like doesn't migrate anymore in the Tetons, which is because of lost connectivity. But yes, that is considered a migration, going from the refuge up in the grove font. But bighorns are actually kind of well known for having a huge broad diversity of behaviors. And that's actually the species that sort of people pioneered looking at elevational migration specifically, because a lot of those animals go more up and down rather than like really far distances.
Like the mountain goats.
Yes.
I want to thank you all for coming to our first Zoom virtual happy hour of 2022. And thanks especially to Kristin and Erica for presenting. That was like the fastest hour of my life. That was so fascinating. Just want to be cognizant of time. It is after 6, but if you guys are comfortable answering a couple more questions, stay on a little bit longer.
I'm happy to hang out if folks still want to talk about anything.
Thanks everyone for joining us this evening. And thanks, Kristin. That was so interesting. I was scribbling notes.
We can talk more about it anytime. Yeah, I also want to thank everyone for showing up. It's fun to be able to just share stuff with people and hear what people are thinking and questions. So yeah, it's really
Well, migration is just a term, and what you did was to put some meat behind the term to expand our knowledge.
nice. I like that phrase, put some meat behind it.
Well, there's some of it in the freezer too,
Another strong benefit of migratory wildlife.
Well, thanks. We're looking forward to the next one that we have.
Yeah,
Thanks for
March
joining me.
17th.
Thanks, everyone.
Kristin, I have a question for you. Do you still have your glide lights?
Well, I stashed them in Cody, so they are still in existence, but I did not keep them personally on me. I only kept the backcountry skis.